In this last part of the lecture series on choosing your detection unit, we'll focus on calls. Now remember, if you choose that the detection unit is calls, your density estimate returned from the fit.ascr function will be call density, and your detection model describes the probability of detecting a call. This brings us to this corner of the decision tree for defining the detection unit. We've decided already that calls will be the detection unit, and now have to estimate call rate as the additional parameter. So we'll speak about estimating call rate here, but first we go through the process of building a capture history from field data. Let's begin with constructing the capture history from field data. We'll start with the same field data that we used in the lecture on triangulation of groups, and we're going to use the correct angles. Remember that the colors indicate that the calls were detected at the same time, along with the type of call, gate call, coda, or hooting. In combination with the type of call, we can use this information to catch calls between detectors. We'll now use this information to build the capture history for the individual calls. We have a total of 10 calls. 8 of them were detected by more than one detector and were localized in this example. And 2 of these were only detected by a single detector and could not be localized. But the important part here is now that we do not need to localize the calls anymore. We do need to match calls between detectors, which we mainly did by using the timestamp for the calls and the type of calls. But we don't need to localize them anymore. This has 2 big advantages. We don't rely so heavily on getting the angles correct, as we don't need to triangulate and map territories. They only help with matching now. And we are able to use the 2 calls that were only detected by a single detector without any question marks. So we end up with 10 records for the 10 calls, and some of these were detected by all 3 detectors, some by 2, and some by only 1. So one of the lessons we learned from this exercise is that you don't need to attribute calls to animals or groups anymore. So if you look at the capture history here, that is the only data that goes into the model, and it does not include any information that relies on identifying individuals or groups. We do not even need to identify the location of the animals as indicated by the colored dots in the image. That just simply helped with the matching. So, however, but we do need to estimate an additional parameter, and that is call rate. So, but we only need to do that if we're interested in turning call density into animal or group density, but we're generally interested in doing that because that's more informative than simply call rate. So we already spoke about this in the lecture on Acoustic SCR, but we learned in the lecture on knowing your species that there are different types of calls. So for gibbons, it is not that simple as depicted in this slide. Remember here we just calculated the call rate as the 27 calls that these animals made during the sampling occasion, and there were 10 animals, so we had 2.7 calls per occasion per animal as the call rate estimate. So we've learned in the lecture Know Your Species, this was chapter 5, that gibbons make various calls, very specific calls, and that not all animals in the group are calling. As a recap, a lot of gibbons engage in singing bouts, which are repetitions of great call coda sequences, where the great call is made by the dominant female of the group, followed by the codas of the dominant male, and male hooting in between. Have a look at chapter 5 if you need a recap on this topic. So this can go on for 5 to 15 or over 30 minutes. So the question then arises what we should use as our detection unit for SCR. Should it be the individual calls, where each call is a new record? Should it be the great calls only? Should it be the singing bouts? This choice will determine how you should build your capture history, what your density estimate is, and what type of calling rate you will need to estimate. In the next few slides, I'm going to use a theoretical example of 11 groups, which sing several bouts consisting of varying numbers of calls each. This example only serves the purpose of illustrating the point that you need to be aware of what consequences your choice in detection unit has. This is not a recommendation of how many samples you need, how many groups you need to follow, or for how many days. This is an advanced topic which we'll cover in a later lecture. So let's have a look at this example with the 11 groups, which we followed for one occasion. Some of them not calling at all, others singing in 1, 2, or 3 bouts during the occasion. I've indicated each occasion with a box. Colors refer to the different groups. So bouts can be also of varying lengths, as you can see in the image. So overall we have 13 bouts between the 11 groups, and we estimate that the average bout rate is 1.18 bouts per occasion per groups. This is simply done by counting up the number of bouts and divide them by the length of the occasion and by the 11 groups. So this gives us 1.18 bouts per occasion per group. When including only great calls, we only include the great calls when estimating great call rate. In this example, 23 great calls were made by the 11 groups, hence the rate is 2.09 great calls per occasion per group. And this is how we calculated that. When including all calls as the detection units, we include all calls for estimating the call rate. In this example, 115 calls were made by the 11 groups. Hence the rate is 10.45 calls per occasion per group. So this adds one more key point to this series. When using singing bouts, great calls, or calls in general as the detection unit, the corresponding call rate needs to be estimated.